Mafia boss's baby cried continuously in the restaurant until the poor waitress calmed her. For 45 minutes, the most feared man in New York couldn't silence his own baby. Plates shattered, men froze, and Anthony, Tony the Beetle Spilatro, a name that made killers flinch, was helpless. Then a broke waitress named Tiffany Olson walked straight into his private room, took the crying child from his arms, and in 30 seconds, did what money, muscle, and fear could not. But as the silence fell, everyone in that restaurant knew. It wasn't mercy that entered his life that night, it was fate. Before we begin, please take a moment to support this channel by clicking the like, share, and subscribe button so you can keep enjoying awesome stories like this. Thank you. Anthony Spilatro sat in the private dining room of Vascello's, Manhattan's most exclusive Italian restaurant, his custom Brioni suit jacket discarded over a leather chair, his silk tie loosened and hanging like a surrender flag, sweat beading across his forehead as his 8-month-old daughter Natalina screamed with an intensity that suggested the world was ending. For 45 unrelenting minutes, the man known throughout New Jersey and New York's underworld as Tony the Beetle, a nickname earned through acts of violence that made grown men whisper, had been completely, utterly powerless against his baby's crying. He tried everything. He walked the private dining room bouncing her gently, then firmly, then desperately. He'd signaled for toys handcrafted by Italian artisans, wooden rattles from Florence, silk stuffed animals from Milan, which Natalina batted away with surprising force. The maitre d' brought warm milk imported from a specific farm in Tuscany, served at precisely 98.6 degrees. She refused it. His bodyguard, a 6'4" former boxer who'd never shown fear in a dozen violent confrontations, stood awkwardly by the door, helpless. His business associates, a federal judge, 2 real estate developers, and a city council member, stared into their risotto with barely concealed amusement, pretending they didn't notice the most feared man in organized crime being humiliated by someone who weighed 15 pounds. The other diners in the main room could hear everything. Crystal chandeliers trembled with each wail. White tablecloths seemed to absorb the sound and amplify it back. This was supposed to be a power dinner, a display of influence in the heart of the Upper East Side's most sophisticated establishment. Instead, it had become a public demonstration that all the money and fear in the world couldn't stop a teething baby from crying. That's when something impossible happened. A young woman in a black server's uniform and crisp white apron walked into the private dining room, carrying a tray of desserts. She was maybe 22, with blonde hair pulled into a practical bun, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who'd been on her feet too long. Unlike every other staff member who'd entered and exited with practiced invisibility, she stopped. She didn't look away or pretend the crying wasn't happening. Instead, she looked directly at Natalina with something Anthony hadn't seen from anyone in years: genuine concern rather than calculated deference. Without asking permission or introducing herself, the waitress set down her tray and approached Anthony. Her voice was quiet, but somehow cut through Natalina's screaming. "May I try?" Anthony was so exhausted, so desperate, and so humiliated that he didn't question why a stranger, a restaurant server, for God's sake, was offering to help. He simply nodded, too depleted to care about protocol, reputation, or the fact that his associates were now staring at this unprecedented scene. The moment the young woman's hands took Natalina from his arms, something miraculous happened. The screaming stopped. Complete, absolute silence fell over not just the private dining room but the entire restaurant as 200 diners, kitchen staff, and managers held their breath, waiting to see if this impossible quiet would last. The waitress wasn't doing anything dramatic. She wasn't bouncing frantically or deploying expensive solutions. She was simply holding Natalina with a confidence that seemed supernatural, her hand placed precisely on the baby's back, humming a soft melody that Anthony had never heard before. Something simple, something genuine, something that sounded like childhood itself. Natalina's eyes, which had been squeezed shut in distress for nearly an hour, slowly opened and focused on the young woman's face. For the first time since they'd arrived at the restaurant, she looked calm, peaceful, almost happy. "How did you?" Anthony whispered, staring at this mysterious waitress who had accomplished in 30 seconds what his money, power, and desperation couldn't achieve in 45 minutes. The young woman smiled gently, still humming, still holding Natalina with that impossible ease. I used to babysit for families in my neighborhood back in Boston. Some babies just need to feel safe, not stimulated. Anthony looked around the room and saw something that made his chest tighten. Every single person, the judge who'd dismissed 3 separate RICO investigations, the developers who'd paid him protection money for a decade, his own bodyguards who'd witnessed him break a man's arm, was staring at them. Not with annoyance or judgment anymore, but with something approaching awe. Even the kitchen staff had gathered in the doorway, watching this ordinary miracle. But what struck Anthony most was what he noticed about this young woman who'd just performed the impossible. Despite her exhaustion, there was an intelligence in her eyes that seemed far beyond her station. The way she held Natalina wasn't just instinct. It was trained knowledge, deliberate technique, practiced skill. "Who are you?" Anthony asked, his voice filled with wonder he hadn't felt in 20 years. The waitress looked at him directly, meeting his eyes with a confidence that nobody showed Tony the Beetle unless they were armed or stupid. She was neither. "My name is Tiffany Olson. I'm 22. I'm a sophomore at Boston University studying child development and early childhood education. I'm working a double shift tonight to help pay my tuition." Anthony felt his understanding of the world shift slightly. The person who had just saved his sanity, who'd calmed his daughter when nothing else could, wasn't some trained nanny from an exclusive agency charging $500 an hour. She was a college student pulling a double shift at an Italian restaurant, someone who probably made in a month what he spent on a single dinner. But as Tiffany continued to hold Natalina, who was now making soft, contented sounds, Anthony had no idea that this chance encounter was about to reveal something he'd been desperately seeking for 8 months. Someone who could give his daughter what his power and money never could. And neither of them knew that what happened next would challenge everything Anthony thought he knew about control, redemption, and what it truly means to be powerful. Because the man who'd built an empire through fear was about to discover that the only thing that mattered couldn't be threatened or bought. It could only be given freely. What Tiffany didn't know was that she'd just entered the life of a man trying to escape the only world he'd ever known, a man who'd do anything, risk anything, to ensure his daughter never became what he was. Anthony Spilatro was 38 years old, and for 2 decades he'd been one of the most feared figures in organized crime between New Jersey and New York. They called him Tony the Beetle because once he latched onto something, a territory, a business, a vendetta, he never let go. He'd built his reputation through strategic violence and an absolute refusal to show weakness. Federal prosecutors had tried 3 times to indict him on RICO charges. Each time, witnesses disappeared or changed their testimony. Evidence vanished. Juries voted to acquit despite overwhelming circumstantial cases. Normally, Anthony moved through the world with complete control. His dinners at Vasello's were legendary displays of influence. Judges, politicians, business leaders all gathering to pay subtle respect to the man who held more real power than any elected official. He'd reserved the private dining room dozens of times, always for important negotiations, always maintaining the reputation that made him untouchable. But tonight was different because 8 months ago, Anthony's world had shattered in a way no rival could have managed. His daughter Natalina had been born on a Tuesday in April, and 3 weeks later, her mother Rosa died from complications that his wealth couldn't prevent and his power couldn't stop. Rosa had been the only person alive who knew the terrified boy beneath the ruthless reputation, the only one who'd ever made him believe he could be something other than what he'd become. Since then, Anthony had been raising Natalina alone, desperate and terrified that she would somehow inherit his legacy of violence instead of the future he was trying to build for her. He'd hired the most expensive nannies from exclusive agencies, specialists who came with credentials from elite families across Europe. But none of them understood what his daughter needed. They knew protocol and procedure. They didn't know love. So here he was, in a restaurant that symbolized his power, completely undone by the one thing his reputation couldn't intimidate, a crying baby who just needed someone to care. And now, watching this exhausted college student hold his daughter with more natural grace than anyone he'd ever paid, Anthony realized something that would change everything. Sometimes the answer you're desperately seeking doesn't come from the world you know. Sometimes it walks in through the service entrance, carrying a tray of desserts, offering help when you're too broken to refuse it, 45 minutes earlier, Tiffany Olson pushed the dessert cart through Vassello's kitchen doors with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to move through expensive spaces without being noticed. Her feet screamed with the particular agony that comes from 14 straight hours in cheap non-slip shoes. The kind of pain that radiates from your arches into your lower back and reminds you exactly how many tables you've served, how many orders you've carried, how many smiles you've manufactured for people who don't see you as fully human. She was 22 years old, and she was so tired she could barely remember what it felt like not to be exhausted. The dessert cart held 8 tiramisu plates arranged with geometric precision, each one a small work of art that cost more than she made in an hour. She'd been pulling double shifts at Vassello's for 6 months now, lunch service from 11 to 3, then dinner service from 5 to midnight, because Boston University's tuition didn't pay itself, and her mother's medical bills certainly weren't going to disappear through wishful thinking. Sophomore year was supposed to be different. In the future Tiffany had imagined back in high school, she'd be living in a dorm, joining study groups, maybe even having time for the things college students were supposed to do. Parties, clubs, those late-night conversations about philosophy and identity that seemed to happen only when you weren't working 60-hour weeks just to stay enrolled. Instead, she lived in a studio apartment in Queens that smelled like the Chinese restaurant downstairs, took her classes online whenever possible, and spent most of her waking hours in restaurants like this one, serving people who spent on a single bottle of wine what she needed for an entire month's rent. Her mother's cancer had been the earthquake that shattered their middle-class stability. Sharon Olson had been a guidance counselor at a suburban Boston high school, the kind of job with decent insurance and a reliable paycheck. But when the diagnosis came, stage 3 ovarian cancer, the treatments that insurance wouldn't cover started piling up. Experimental therapies, out-of-network specialists, the desperate mathematics of trying to save a life when the system decides that life isn't worth the cost. By the time her mother went into remission, their family savings had been obliterated. The house in Newton was gone, sold to pay the bills. Tiffany's college fund had evaporated. Her younger brother had moved in with their aunt in Connecticut, and Tiffany had made a choice: drop out of Boston University or find a way to work her way through. She chose to work. Most people who knew Tiffany's story called it determination. She called it survival. Child development and early childhood education had been her dream since she was 16, since the summer she'd spent babysitting for 3 different families in her neighborhood and discovered that she had a gift for understanding what children needed. Not just the obvious things, food, sleep, clean diapers, but the emotional architecture that helped them feel safe enough to grow. The cart's wheel caught on an uneven tile as she approached the private dining room, and she steadied it with muscle memory, barely breaking stride. That's when she heard it. Crying. Not the fussy, tired crying that every parent knew, but the desperate, primal wailing that suggested genuine distress. It had been going on for at least 30 minutes, growing progressively more intense, and every server in Vassello's had been studiously ignoring it because you didn't acknowledge disruption in a restaurant like this, especially not in the private dining room, where the kind of people who commanded power and discretion gathered. Tiffany paused outside the door. Through the frosted glass, she could see silhouettes. A large man pacing with a small bundle, other figures seated around the table in various states of uncomfortable stillness. She'd worked at Vassello's long enough to recognize the particular tension of important people pretending not to notice chaos. She also knew who was in that room. Antonio Spilatro, Tony the Beetle. The other servers whispered about him when he reserved the private dining room. Stories that were half urban legend, half genuine terror. The maitre d' always personally handled his table. The kitchen sent out their absolute best work. Nobody made mistakes when Spilatro was dining. The smart move was to deliver the desserts to table 12, collect her tips, and get through the last hour of her shift without incident. The professional move was to let the maitre d' handle whatever was happening in the private room. The safe move was to stay invisible. Tiffany pushed the door open. What separates the people who change the world from those who merely watch is often just one decision: the decision to act when everyone else hesitates. Tiffany made that choice in a moment most would have walked past. How many moments like this do you encounter in your own life? And how many do you ignore? If you want to stay aware, to be reminded of your own capacity for courage, you need to be watching these stories. Subscribe right now before the algorithm decides you never see content like this again. The scene inside was worse than she'd imagined. The man she recognized from whispered descriptions, dark hair slicked back, broad shoulders, the kind of presence that made rooms feel smaller, was holding a baby who looked about 8 months old. His expensive suit jacket was draped over a chair. His tie hung loose, and his face held an expression Tiffany had never expected to see on someone with his reputation. Pure, helpless desperation. The baby's crying had that edge of exhaustion that meant she'd been at it for a while. That primal sound that made something in Tiffany's chest tighten with professional recognition and human empathy. This wasn't a spoiled baby throwing a tantrum. This was a distressed infant who'd crossed into overstimulation territory and couldn't self-regulate back to calm. Tiffany knew exactly what that looked like. She'd seen it dozens of times in the 3 summers she'd spent babysitting for families in her Newton neighborhood. The Johnsons' twin boys who'd melted down at the 4th of July fireworks. The Pattersons' daughter who'd sobbed for 2 hours during a thunderstorm. The Chun family's baby who'd been inconsolable until Tiffany figured out that he needed less stimulation, not more. She set her dessert tray down on the sideboard and approached the table. Every instinct told her this was a terrible idea. This man was dangerous. These people were powerful. She was nobody, a waitress from Queens with student loans and a mother in remission and no business inserting herself into situations that didn't concern her. But the baby concerned her. Children always concerned her. That's why she'd chosen early childhood education as her major despite knowing it wouldn't make her rich, wouldn't impress anyone at her high school reunion, wouldn't solve the financial crisis that had upended her family. She stopped a respectful distance from Anthony Spilatro and met his eyes. Up close, he looked less like the criminal from whispered stories and more like an exhausted father who'd run out of options. The baby in his arms had tears streaming down her red face, her little fists clenched with frustration. Tiffany spoke quietly, letting her voice cut through the crying without competing with it. "May I try?" There was no deference in the question, no acknowledgement of his reputation or power. Just quiet confidence born from hundreds of hours spent with children, from a genuine belief that she might be able to help. She didn't wait for permission to step closer, already reading the baby's body language, the tension in her spine, the way she was arching away from comfort rather than into it, the overstimulation markers that most people missed. Anthony stared at her for a long moment, and Tiffany wondered if she'd made a catastrophic mistake. Then he nodded, too desperate to question why a stranger was offering help. The moment Tiffany's hands touched the baby, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility and possibility. This was what she was good at. This was why she'd survived 3 years of her mother's cancer treatments, why she worked double shifts, why she'd refused to give up on a dream that seemed increasingly impractical. Because sometimes, when everyone else saw chaos or annoyance or something to be managed with money and power, Tiffany saw a child who simply needed someone to understand them. She began to hum, the same lullaby her mother had sung to her, the one she'd used with every baby she'd cared for. And slowly, impossibly, the crying began to fade into stunned silence. Tiffany took Nadalina from Anthony's arms with a gentleness that seemed almost supernatural, cradling the baby against her chest with one hand supporting her head, the other placed precisely on her back between the shoulder blades. She didn't bounce frantically like Anthony had been doing. She didn't reach for toys or bottles or any of the expensive solutions scattered across the table. Instead, she did something far more powerful. She hummed. The melody was simple, a lullaby her mother had sung during those long Boston winters when Tiffany couldn't sleep. Something about stars and moonlight that had no formal name, just the warm acoustic memory of childhood itself. Nothing sophisticated, nothing that could be purchased or replicated by professionals. Just genuine human tenderness translated into sound. The response was immediate. Within seconds, Nadalina's desperate wailing began to diminish, transforming from primal screams into confused whimpers, then into soft hiccuping breaths. Her tiny body, which had been rigid with distress, started to relax against Tiffany's chest. The change was so rapid it seemed impossible. The entire restaurant felt it. 200 diners, powerful executives, politicians, old money families accustomed to commanding every room they entered, stopped mid-conversation and held their breath. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Wine glasses remained suspended. Even the kitchen staff, visible through the service window, had gone completely still. Anthony stood frozen, watching this 22-year-old waitress accomplish in 30 seconds what he couldn't achieve in 45 minutes. He'd been undone before, by violence, by strategic betrayals, by the occasional federal prosecutor who got too close to evidence that mattered. But he'd never been undone by tenderness. He'd never witnessed power that came from pure compassion rather than calculated force. In a world where we're constantly told that everything is transactional, that power comes through domination, that money solves everything, watching someone solve the unsolvable through pure compassion feels like a miracle. And we need miracles. We need to remember that genuine human connection still matters. Don't let the cynicism of the algorithm strip this from you. Subscribe now so you never lose touch with stories that restore your faith in humanity. The silence that fell across Vassellos was more powerful than any threat Anthony had ever made. It was the kind of quiet that arrives when something genuinely extraordinary happens, when the normal rules of the world temporarily suspend and everyone witnesses the same impossible moment together. Across the private dining room, his bodyguards exchanged confused glances. Marco, who'd been with Anthony for 12 years and had never shown uncertainty in a firefight, looked genuinely baffled. Vincent, standing by the door, had his mouth slightly open in disbelief. They'd seen their boss render people peaceful through intimidation, through calculated violence, through the mere weight of his reputation. They'd never seen him rendered peaceful by someone else, especially not by an exhausted college student in a server's uniform. Nadalina slept peacefully in Anthony's arms, her small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of genuine rest. For the first time in months, maybe since Rosa died, he watched his daughter without the crushing weight of terror that had become his constant companion. The private dining room had emptied. His associates had departed with awkward congratulations. The restaurant staff was cleaning the main room in preparation for closing. Tiffany stood a respectful distance away, professionally ready to leave, but Anthony found himself unable to let this moment end. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit with me, please, just for a moment." She hesitated, then sat, her posture revealing exhaustion but also curiosity. Anthony looked at his sleeping daughter and felt words rising that he hadn't spoken to anyone in 8 months. "Her mother's name was Rosa," he began, his voice quieter than Tiffany had heard it. "She died 3 weeks after Nadalina was born. Complications from childbirth that the doctors said were rare, unpredictable. My wealth couldn't save her. My connections, my power, none of it mattered against mortality." He looked up at Tiffany, and she saw something in his eyes that newspapers would never capture. Genuine grief beneath the hardened exterior. Rosa was the only person who knew the terrified boy underneath all this. He gestured vaguely at himself, the expensive clothes, the reputation, the armor he wore. "She knew I wanted out. That I'd been trying to build legitimate businesses for 2 years before Nadalina arrived, because I was tired of being what everyone needed me to be." Tiffany listened without judgment, without the fear she should probably feel sitting across from a man with his reputation. "I've hired 6 different caregivers since Rosa died," Anthony continued. "Professionals from the most exclusive agencies. Women with credentials from European royal families. None of them worked. They knew protocol and procedure, but they didn't." He paused, searching for words. "You knew Nadalina for 30 seconds and cared more than people I paid thousands of dollars to care. Most of us settle. We accept mediocre solutions. We hire people out of desperation. We convince ourselves that expensive fixes must be the right ones. But what if the answer to what we're desperately seeking is simpler than we think? What if it's already standing right in front of us? If you're someone who's always searching for better, for truth, for those moments when everything clicks into place, you absolutely cannot miss what comes next. Subscribe now, because the next chapter might contain the insight that changes your perspective on everything." Anthony watched Tiffany's face, seeing genuine compassion there, and a question began forming that would change both their lives. Could this exhausted college student be the answer he'd been desperately seeking? "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to really consider it." Tiffany stood in the marble lobby of the building on Central Park West, her reflection staring back from polished surfaces that probably cost more than her entire year's tuition. The doorman had called up to announce her, speaking in hushed, deferential tones that suggested he knew exactly who lived in the penthouse and what that meant. She'd received the call at 7 that morning. A polite woman asking if Miss Olson could visit Mr. Spilatro's residence at 10. No explanation. Just a car that would pick her up from her Queens apartment. Now, riding the private elevator that opened directly into the penthouse, Tiffany wondered if she'd somehow violated protocol last night. Maybe you weren't supposed to touch a mafia boss's baby without permission. Maybe there were rules she'd broken that would have consequences she couldn't imagine. The elevator doors opened onto a space that took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park, the winter morning light streaming across hardwood floors that gleamed like water. Abstract paintings hung on walls, the kind she recognized from her art history elective, pieces that belonged in museums rather than private homes. The furniture was minimal but clearly expensive, each piece chosen with impeccable taste. Through an open doorway, she glimpsed a nursery decorated in soft grays and whites, with a crib that looked handcrafted and a mobile of delicate glass birds catching the light. Anthony stood by the windows, holding Natalina, and the baby was smiling, genuinely smiling, making those happy gurgling sounds that healthy, content infants make. He'd changed from last night's rumpled suit into casual clothes that still managed to look expensive, and without the context of the restaurant's crisis, he appeared almost ordinary. Almost. "Miss Olson," he said, walking toward her. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." He gestured to a leather couch positioned to face the park view. Tiffany sat, her server's instinct making her perch on the edge rather than settling back comfortably. Anthony handed Natalina to a woman Tiffany hadn't noticed, an older woman in professional attire who took the baby with practiced efficiency and disappeared into another room. Then he sat across from Tiffany, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, studying her with an intensity that should have been intimidating but somehow wasn't. "I'm going to be direct," he began. "I want to hire you as Natalina's full-time caregiver. $100,000 per year, plus housing in the guest wing of this penthouse, full healthcare coverage, and unlimited resources for your education. Boston University's tuition fully covered. Whatever books, tutors, or programs you need for your degree." Tiffany felt the room tilt slightly. $100,000. That was nearly 4 times what she'd make in a year of double shifts at Vassallo's. That was her mother's medical debt erased. That was financial security she'd stopped believing existed for people like her. "I can't," she heard herself say. "I appreciate the offer, but I can't leave Boston University. My degree." "You won't leave." Anthony cut her off, not rudely, but with the certainty of someone who'd already thought through every objection. "Boston University has excellent online programs. I'll hire private tutors for any courses that require in-person work. You'll complete your degree, possibly faster than the traditional track. And if you want to pursue graduate school afterward, I'll fund that too." "Why?" The question came out sharper than Tiffany intended. "You don't know me. Last night showed me something I've been searching for since Rosa died." Anthony's voice carried a weight that made Tiffany stop talking. "I've hired professionals who knew every technique, every developmental milestone, every protocol. None of them knew my daughter. You knew her in 30 seconds. That's not something I can buy from an agency." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the park. "I'm trying to leave the life," he said quietly. "Building legitimate businesses, real estate, restaurants, investments that won't destroy my daughter's future. There's an FBI investigation. I'm negotiating a plea deal that will likely mean prison time, but minimal if I cooperate fully. I've even hired a former FBI agent as a consultant to help me navigate this transition." He turned back to face her. "I need someone who understands child development. Someone with genuine compassion. Someone who won't be here just for a paycheck, but because they actually care what happens to a little girl whose mother died and whose father is trying not to let her inherit a legacy of violence." How many times in your life have you stood at a crossroads where one choice led to the safe, expected path, and another led into genuine transformation? Most people choose safety. Most people say no to the unexpected. But Tiffany said yes to something that terrified her because she recognized that some moments are invitations from destiny itself. Tiffany looked at Anthony Spilatro, this feared man who was offering her more money than she'd ever imagined, asking her to help raise his daughter while he tried to become someone different, and saw something no one else would see. Genuine desperation mixed with genuine hope. If you're someone who believes you're meant for something more, she thought, that you're capable of changing someone's life, this is that moment. I'll do it, she said. But not just for the money. I need you to promise that you're serious about changing. That Natalina won't grow up around violence. Anthony met her eyes and nodded. You have my word. Whatever that's worth to you. Tiffany stood and extended her hand. Then we have a deal. 6 months passed in what felt like a single breath and a lifetime simultaneously. Tiffany moved into the penthouse's guest wing on a cold December morning, her belongings fitting into 2 suitcases that looked almost comical in the walk-in closet larger than her entire queen studio. The first weeks were about establishing routines, wake times, feeding schedules, play sessions structured around developmental milestones. She implemented techniques from her child development courses, tummy time to strengthen Natalina's core, age-appropriate sensory play, consistent sleep training that actually worked because it was based on attachment theory rather than expensive gadgets. Natalina flourished. Her babbling increased from random sounds to intentional communication. She learned to sit unassisted, then to crawl with determined focus across the penthouse's gleaming floors. Most importantly, her attachment to Tiffany became secure, the kind of bond that child psychology textbooks described, but Tiffany had only witnessed in the healthiest families she'd babysat for. Anthony watched this transformation with something approaching awe. He began asking Tiffany questions about child development, actually listening to her answers, implementing her suggestions. He learned to read Natalina's cues, when she needed stimulation versus quiet, when her crying meant hunger versus overtiredness. For the first time since Rose's death, he began to understand what fatherhood could mean beyond providing and protecting. Tiffany's education continued seamlessly. Tutors arrived at the penthouse for subjects requiring direct instruction. She completed her Boston University coursework online, often studying after Natalina's bedtime while Anthony worked in his office. The arrangement was working better than either of them had anticipated. But beneath the domestic routines, Anthony's other life continued its transformation. FBI meetings happened in downtown offices. Federal prosecutors discussed testimony and evidence. His associates began noticing his withdrawal from certain operations, territory he'd controlled for years suddenly reassigned, meetings he no longer attended, decisions made without his input. One evening in March, Anthony told Tiffany about his childhood. A poor Italian immigrant family in Newark. His father working construction, drinking away paychecks, using his fists when words failed. How violence became the only language Anthony understood, the only tool that seemed to work in a world that respected nothing else. I became what I needed to survive, he said quietly. And then I became what everyone expected me to be. By the time I realized I could choose differently, I'd already done things that can't be undone. Tiffany's admiration for him grew not despite his honesty, but because of it. He never tried to justify his past, never minimized what he'd done. His values and education, or lack thereof, contrasted sharply with hers, but his determination to change felt genuine in a way that expensive solutions never could be. The tension came in April when one of Anthony's former associates was found dead in the Hudson. Tiffany read the newspaper article and understood, perhaps for the first time, the true extent of what Anthony had been. Not just organized crime in abstract terms, but actual violence, actual deaths, actual destruction of families like hers. She confronted him that evening after Natalina was asleep. Tell me the truth. All of it. Anthony did. The extortion, the money laundering, the orchestrated violence. He didn't spare details or soften his role. When he finished, Tiffany sat in silence for several minutes. Forgiveness is the most powerful force in human relationships, yet we rarely talk about it honestly. Watching someone genuinely transform their life requires witnessing both their darkness and their light, and most people can't stay present for that journey. But the people who do, the people who understand that redemption is possible, they're the ones who understand human nature itself. I should leave, Tiffany finally said. I understand. But I'm not going to. Anthony looked up, surprise crossing his face. Not because I condone what you did, Tiffany continued, but because I believe what you're doing now matters more than what you were. Natalina needs me. And maybe you do too. Later that night, as Tiffany checked on sleeping Natalina, Anthony appeared in the nursery doorway. You're not just my daughter's caregiver, he said quietly. You're my redemption in human form. The proof that I can choose differently. Tiffany didn't respond, But she didn't disagree either. The news broke on a Tuesday morning in February 2021, 18 months after that first dinner at Vassello's. Tiffany was feeding Nadalina breakfast, the toddler now confidently using a spoon, making delighted messes with oatmeal, when Anthony walked into the kitchen holding his phone with an expression she'd never seen before. Pure, cold fear. "It leaked," he said simply. "The prosecutors. My cooperation agreement. It's all over the news." The federal indictment was devastating in its comprehensiveness. 17 counts of racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, witness tampering, and crimes Tiffany had only read about in news articles about people she'd never imagined knowing. The document detailed 2 decades of criminal enterprise, naming names, describing operations, laying out a case that would have destroyed Anthony if he hadn't already agreed to cooperate. His plea deal was straightforward: testify fully against his former associates, provide evidence and documentation, accept prison time in exchange for reduced sentencing. He'd known this day was coming. He'd prepared for it. What he hadn't prepared for was how the leak would put everyone in his life, everyone who mattered, directly in danger. Within hours, armed security guards appeared in the penthouse. Former military, professionals who moved through the space with quiet efficiency, installing additional locks, checking sight lines from windows, converting Nadalina's nursery with safety protocols that made Tiffany's stomach clench with understanding. She was complicit now. In the eyes of Anthony's former organization, she wasn't an innocent caregiver. She was leverage, a target, someone who could be used to send messages or exact revenge. That evening, after Nadalina was asleep behind reinforced doors, Anthony found Tiffany in her study, staring at her laptop without really seeing it. "I should never have brought you into this," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "You deserve to make this choice with full knowledge of what it would mean. Now you're—" "I'm staying," Tiffany interrupted. "I'm not leaving. You don't understand what these people are capable of." "I understand perfectly." She stood, facing him directly. "And I'm staying because what you're doing, this transformation, this choice to testify, to change, it's the most important thing happening. Not just for you. For Nadalina. She needs to see that people can choose differently, even when it's dangerous." The following week, federal prosecutors requested a meeting with Tiffany. In a downtown office that smelled of old coffee and institutional anxiety, they asked her about Anthony's state of mind, his relationship with his daughter, his genuine desire to change. She'd become a crucial witness, not to his crimes, but to his redemption. "He's different," she told them. "Not performing difference. Actually different." But the threats were real. Another of Anthony's former associates was found dead in the Hudson, a message written in violence that everyone understood. Phone calls came to the penthouse's unlisted number. No words, just silence that felt like a promise. Cars followed Tiffany when she took Nadalina to the park, keeping just enough distance to be noticed without being threatening enough for police intervention. Anthony wanted to send them away, somewhere safe, somewhere his past couldn't reach. But Tiffany refused. "I won't abandon you when you need people most," she said firmly. "We're a family now. Families don't run." In March, the official notice arrived. Sentencing hearing scheduled for March 14th, 2022. 1 year away. 1 year to prepare for the moment when everything would change again, when the man who transformed himself would face consequences for who he'd been. 1 year to prove that redemption was worth the cost. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was designed to intimidate. Marble columns, vaulted ceilings, the particular silence of spaces where justice was meant to be absolute. Tiffany sat in the front row with Nadalina between her and the empty seat reserved for family, watching people file in with the grim efficiency of those accustomed to witnessing consequences. Nadalina was nearly 3 now, wearing a navy dress Tiffany had carefully chosen, her dark hair pulled back with a clip. In her small hands, she clutched a drawing she'd made that morning, stick figures labeled in Tiffany's handwriting: Daddy, Tiffany, and Nadalina, with a bright yellow sun overhead and grass rendered in enthusiastic green scribbles. When Anthony entered in handcuffs, flanked by federal marshals, Nadalina's face lit up. "Daddy," she called out, her voice cutting through the courtroom's formality. The marshals paused, and Anthony looked at his daughter with such naked emotion that several people in the gallery looked away, unable to witness that particular kind of pain. The prosecution's summary was devastating. 17 counts spanning 2 decades. The assistant U.S. attorney recited crimes in clinical detail. Racketeering operations that destroyed legitimate businesses, money laundering schemes that moved millions through shell corporations, extortion that ruined families, and violence that left bodies in the Hudson River. The recitation took 40 minutes, each word adding weight to the understanding that Anthony Spilotro had not been merely adjacent to organized crime. He had orchestrated it, profited from it, built an empire on fear and suffering. This was a man who had murdered people, who had destroyed lives with the same calculation he might use to order dinner. The gravity of what he'd done hung in the courtroom like smoke, inescapable and suffocating. When given the opportunity to address the court, Anthony stood. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of genuine remorse rather than performance. "Your Honor, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it." He paused, his eyes finding Tiffany and Natalina. 2.5 years ago, I sat in a restaurant, powerless to comfort my crying daughter. A young woman, a stranger, showed me something I'd forgotten existed. That day at the restaurant, I realized that power built on fear is actually powerlessness. True power is inspiring someone to believe in your transformation. His voice broke slightly. Miss Tiffany Olsen saved not just my daughter, but my soul. She stayed when anyone sensible would have run. She believed I could become someone different when I'd stopped believing it myself. She's the reason I'm standing here accepting responsibility rather than fighting charges I know I'm guilty of. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd presided over countless organized crime cases, showed visible emotion. This was not a typical sentencing. When she announced the verdict, her voice was measured but not without compassion. 5 years in federal prison, with credit for time served during pretrial detention and cooperation. Eligible for supervised release with strict conditions. 5 years. Significantly less than the 15 to 20 typical for such charges. A reflection of his cooperation, yes, but also of something the judge seemed to recognize as genuine transformation. Anthony turned and looked at Tiffany and Natalina. They nodded, a communication beyond words that contained promises and understanding and the acceptance of what came next. Tiffany's resolve crystallized in that moment. She would wait. She would advocate. She would help Natalina understand that her father was choosing to face consequences rather than run from them. As federal marshals approached to escort Anthony away, Natalina began to cry, not the desperate wailing of infancy, but the heartbroken sobbing of a child who understood separation. Tiffany lifted her, holding her close, watching Anthony disappear through a side door into the future he'd chosen. "Daddy's being brave," she whispered to Natalina. "And we're going to be brave too." 3 years later, Tiffany sat in a different courthouse, this time for a parole hearing rather than sentencing. She wore professional attire now, the kind that came with being Dr. Tiffany Olsen, licensed child psychologist. Beside her sat Natalina, 6 years old, wearing a dress she'd chosen herself and holding a new drawing for her father. The transformation in Tiffany's life had been extraordinary. She'd completed her undergraduate degree while Anthony was in prison, then immediately enrolled in a master's program in child psychology. Her thesis focused on attachment theory in children who'd experienced parental incarceration, research informed by her own experience with Natalina. Now she worked with at-risk children in the Bronx, specializing in trauma and attachment disorders, using everything she'd learned from both her education and her unlikely family. Natalina had flourished into a brilliant, emotionally secure child who understood her father's journey with the clarity that children sometimes possess. She knew he'd made terrible choices before she was born. She knew he was in prison because he was trying to make things right. She visited him monthly with Tiffany, their conversations honest in ways that many families never managed. The parole board reviewed Anthony's record with clinical precision. He'd participated in every rehabilitation program offered, earned his GED, then an associate's degree in business management, taught financial literacy classes to other inmates, completed anger management, trauma therapy, and restorative justice programs. His behavior had been exemplary for 3 years straight. When invited to testify, Tiffany approached the microphone as Dr. Olsen, clinical professional, not as the young waitress who'd once calmed a crying baby. "I'm here to speak about Mr. Spilotro's genuine psychological transformation," she began. 3 years ago, I watched him accept full responsibility for decades of harm. But that's not what convinced me his change was real. What convinced me happened years before that, in a restaurant, when he was willing to accept help from someone he had no reason to trust. That moment revealed his capacity for vulnerability, for genuine transformation, for choosing differently even when it terrified him. She paused, meeting the eyes of each board member. Redemption isn't comfortable. It requires witnessing someone's darkness and believing in their capacity for light. I've witnessed both. And I can tell you, as a trained psychologist, and as someone who's known him for over 5 years, that Anthony Spilatro is not the same man who committed those crimes. The parole board deliberated for 20 minutes. When they returned, the chairwoman's face was unreadable. Approved for supervised release, effective immediately, with conditions. The moment Anthony walked into the waiting area, thinner, older, wearing civilian clothes that hung slightly loose, Nadalina ran to him with the unself-consciousness of a child who'd never doubted this moment would come. He lifted her, and for the first time in 3 years, held his daughter without barriers between them. His tears were genuine, the kind that come from a man who once relied on fear, discovering that love was infinitely more powerful. 2 weeks later, they sat together in Anthony's new apartment in Brooklyn, modest, legitimately funded through his share of a restaurant venture he'd helped establish before his incarceration. Tiffany had brought the framed letter he'd sent her during his 2nd year in prison, words she'd kept on her desk through graduate school. "You reminded me that I'm not just who I was," she read aloud. "I could choose who to become." Anthony looked at her, at Nadalina coloring quietly on the floor, at the life he'd built from ruins. "And you showed me what choice actually looks like," he said quietly. "Not the illusion of control, but the real power of deciding to change." Nadalina looked up from her drawing. "Daddy, did you used to be a bad person?" The question hung in the air, honest, direct, deserving of truth. "Yes," Anthony answered. "I hurt people. I made terrible choices that caused real harm. But I decided to become different. That doesn't erase what I did, but it means I'm not that person anymore. And you won't be that person again? No, sweetheart. Never again." Stories like this don't come around often. Stories where a real person genuinely transforms, where redemption isn't just a word but a lived reality. In a world that constantly tells us people can't change, that the powerful can't become human, that redemption is a fantasy. This story proves otherwise. But you need to see it, and you need to remember it. When you're tempted to believe that change is impossible, that people are fixed in their nature, this story will return to you. Tiffany watched Anthony with his daughter, this man who'd chosen the hardest path available because a young waitress had once shown him that tenderness was stronger than fear. Redemption, she understood, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about genuinely becoming different, one choice at a time, even when the world insisted change was impossible. And sometimes, it started with a crying baby in a restaurant and a stranger who chose compassion over caution. Subscribe right now so you never lose access to the stories that restore your faith in human possibility. And more than that, comment below and tell us, do you believe in redemption? Have you witnessed genuine transformation in someone's life? Your story matters. Your voice in this community matters. Don't just consume this story, become part of it. Asterisk.